The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Pantsula Podcast, brought to you by the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. For those of you who are not familiar with the A-APRP, we are founded by Kwame and Nkrumah in 1968. Our objective is Pan-Africanism, and we define it as the total liberation of Africa under scientific socialism. Today, I have my fellow comrade Jamilah, who I'll let introduce the two ancestors we'll be honoring today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Winfred. And I have to note, this is our first episode together.
Mhm.
This is like,
Yeah, crazy enough.
Congratulations. So our two ancestors we're honoring today, Fila, Portia, and Ndwandwe, and Kofi Badu, or Cuffy. So Fila Ndwandwe, she was a dental therapy student when she was recruited as part of the NATO machinery of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, or the MK, which is the armed wing of the African National Congress. She was recruited in 1985. She was one of many arrested and was released upon condition of her being what is known as a state witness. While in Swaziland, where she escaped to and kept fighting after her release, she was abducted by informants as she was feeding her 2-month-old baby, with the insistence that she would be an informant as well. She never relinquished, and as a result was tortured and assassinated. Our other ancestor is Kofi Badu, who is widely known as Cuffy. He was shipped to Guyana. At the time, it was a Dutch colony called Berbice. On a plantation in Lilienburg at the Kanji River, he led a revolt of over 2,500 enslaved Africans. Cuffy's objective was in establishing a free republic. Berbice was briefly taken over by the military strategy of Cuffy and his comrades in the struggle for liberation. So, as usual, we are honoring those two ancestors as well as many of our ancestors in the struggle, because without them, we wouldn't be here doing the work we do. So thank you to our ancestors. Ashe.
And so in this week's podcast, we'll be discussing Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. So in our Kaji circles, we usually discuss a variety of different books throughout the year. This was one of the books that we discussed over the past several weeks. And we completed this this past week. And so we just want to do a review of different points that we saw, different questions that we had, and different themes that we pointed out in our discussions. So Jamilah, what were some major themes or points made in Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery that intrigued you?
I think the points made, or at least one of them, is a pretty consistent point made in a lot of the books we do for our work study process, that things do not change as long as capitalism is a domineering system. The technology may change, but the intent does not. And one of the major points in the book was discussing enslavement, of course, and how the enslavers or colonizers, they utilize slavery to their benefit. So when it no longer benefited them, they said, okay, yeah, we want to abolish slavery in order to fight the other forces. So say there was a liberation struggle in the Caribbean or a liberation struggle anywhere in the global South, and there was an end of enslavement, but there was a little corner of the world that had it. And the colonizers wanted to be the domineering force. So it's like, well, we support abolishing slavery as long as it creates an economic situation which is not advantageous for who we consider our enemy. And we're looking at this in this day and age as well, to the point of capitalism as a dominating force just doesn't change. So, we want to support embargoes for some places, but not for others, or we want to we want to give this country these particular loans, but not other countries for loans. And so one of the things that's occurring is we want to create sanctions for Russia to get to Venezuela or to get to Cuba. And so it's not sanctions for the purpose of sanctions, but as we know, sanctions deal with killing, deal with harming masses of people. So it's not just dealing with one country, it's dealing with the masses of people around the world. Say there's a resource like oil, people are like, well, oil's so expensive right now. Why is it expensive? Because it's a war on the people. It's not to simply get back again at a president or some diplomat or whatever. Sanctions are always going to affect the masses of the people in a negative way. So we have to understand, there's every episode, there are several points I repeat, this might be one of them. So capitalism, the intent is always the same. The methods might change, the technology might change, but the intent is always the same. And the intent is to negatively affect the people, the masses of the people. Because when you negatively affect the masses of the people and they don't feel like they have anywhere to go, they feel that going to you is their only option. So capitalism continues to do that. They did that in Capitalism and Slavery. They did that in many of the other books we discuss in our work study process.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like capitalism really requires a sense of, one of its core principles is the idea of like constant growth and the constant use of resources, even in places where there aren't any resources. So like even in this case, with regards to like slavery and like the different companies who are trying to basically create and accumulate wealth for themselves, what they do is like go to other countries, whether it's the Americas or Africa or Asia, collect and amass as many resources as possible, regardless of like any concept of morality or any concept of fairness or any concept of acknowledging human beings as actual people, to accumulate and exploit as much as they could.
That's the thing about capitalism, though, is that it doesn't have morals. I tend to say that capitalism is both amoral and immoral. It's amoral in that it's about its own benefit. It doesn't care who or what it harms, what resources get stolen, lands being clear-cutted. It doesn't matter as long as there is personal satisfaction out of it. Immoral in that it does harm people, it does harm the land. And so I think you could look at it in both ways. I know people tend to just say immoral because it doesn't take sides on anything, but it does take a particular side in that it harms people. So of course it's amoral and immoral.
And like actually from this book, there's a quote that Williams points out. So like in this case, they're talking about slavery and the slave trade in Liverpool, and discussing whether or not slaves or enslaved African peoples should have a day off and should be taught Christianity for the sake of embracing the gospel. He states that Sherlock, who became the later Bishop of London, not Sherlock Holmes, a different Sherlock, he noted that, quote, Christianity and the embracing of the gospel does not make the least difference in civil property, end quote. So it's saying that even a Bishop of London would assumably have, they recognize that those morals and like that Christianity didn't really impact their own understandings of like what was profitable and what action should they take to maximize profit. And I think that goes into a larger point. The conditions and the things that people do are largely based on economic factors. So Williams himself, he mentions that the attitude of the churchman wasn't very different from the attitude of the layman, in the sense that slavery was just the economic aspect of the time. It wasn't moral in the sense of, oh, we believe that this would promote human quality or reduce human suffering. It was mainly just, this is how the economy works. And the economy is meant to maximize profit for capitalists. So even if you go to the first chapter, He mentions discussing more about how the conditions and economic conditions were based on the land. He mentions really from the beginning, Africans who were enslaved were brought in or because they were a cheap labor force. So he makes the argument that it wasn't really as a factor of race as much of just economic needs. So initially, it was the Native Americans that Europeans obliterated and assassinated en masse. The remaining people from those communities that they tried to force to do labor. When that didn't work, they used indentured servants, Europeans who, whether it were like indentured servants who agreed to be servants, redemptioners, so people who didn't pay their debts and like chose to do labor instead of paying their debts, or convicts who were sent there temporarily for punishment. Though the capitalists and the people who own the means of production were trying to find ways to make the most of the land. So use as much labor as was possible in order to create in order to create cash crops or products that they could sell back to Europe. They even went to the point Williams mentions of kidnapping. So when there weren't enough prisoners, there weren't enough people who voluntarily went to the Americas. They kidnapped people, even in England, and the English government even supported this in the sense of creating laws that made it hard for really most people to escape being a criminal. And so those criminals would be sent for as quote unquote for transportation to the colonies. They made it a capital offense for like shoplifting, stealing clothes, hurting animals, being in a trade union, or like they quote unquote picking a pocket for more than a shilling. And so the only alternative to death for those crimes were to be a servant in the colony. Politicians were in on this. The king and queen were in on this, and like most aspects of the society were in on it, except for the people, because they were the ones who could be sent to across the world or be hanged as a prisoner for doing those things.
To your point, this is what's going on to this day. The prison industrial complex continues the system. So some states do not allow for capital punishment, but there are long prison sentences. There's slave labor. So there's people in prison making your furniture right now, making your computers right now. So this idea of the end of slavery, and people talk about 1863, et cetera, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, whatever. But the prison industrial complex still exists to this day, and there is slave labor. There were people free of pay fighting forest fires. So that's an important discussion I have to this day. So what you were addressing in the book is still occurring to this day. Capitalism, the intent is the same. The technology may change, but the intent is always the same, which is why we have to get rid of it. And to the point of being immoral and amoral, there's a portion in the book that does talk about the Barclay family, and talked about the Quaker connection to that. And a lot of people discuss the Quaker connections in the fight against enslavement and being pro-abolition, et cetera. But reading this book, it actually does contradict that in a way, because a lot of these families of industry married into each other in order to keep the industry to itself. And the Barclay family was no different. So they were infighting about whether or not slavery was moral, but they still kept the resources to themselves, created banks, which was profited off of the backs of enslavement. So to say that, outright, it's either one way or another, we have to look dialectically at everything and how these families continued the wealth by marrying into each other. So this idea that an individual can attain generational wealth without exploitation, read this book and that will completely dispel all of that for you.
Yeah. Like even the guy, I know there's this, Williams mentions that there's this, he was a former slave trader that stopped being a slave trader, and he's the one who wrote, it's this popular hymn. Uh, I'm forgetting the
What
name.
Amazing Grace, isn't it?
Amazing
Yeah.
Grace, yes. So the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, he used to be a slave trader, and even after he stopped slave trading, one thing that he mentioned, that he prayed for future slave trips. So even people who leave as individuals, it doesn't mean that they did it because they were against slavery. It just meant that they stopped as an individual.
Absolutely. This is why we need to look at things systemically as opposed to individual situations. And we're conditioned to look at individual success. We're conditioned to look at one man can change society. That's absolutely false. And that's against science. Every system that has been changed because the masses changed that system. And I'm going to keep saying, I've said it on several episodes, people emphasize the American Revolution or the French Revolution, all these European-based revolutions, but somehow Africans can't have a revolution, even though there was the Haitian Revolution, even though there were revolutions in the Caribbean, but somehow Africans and colonized people around the world are supposed to sit down, but y'all talk all day, every day about the American Revolution or bring back 1776, all of this. But somehow we can't do that. So just think about that. Just think about the contradictions in even that conversation when it comes to discussing revolution.
Exactly.
And the falsehood that Africans have not participated in them, or people in the global South or colonized people have not participated in them.
What were some revolutions or details of revolutions that Williams mentioned, or that is just commonly available for us to?
Talked about Cuba, talked about places in the Caribbean, St. Dominique. There were several places, and I did actually want to talk about the price of sugar in the Caribbean. So people are talking about gas right now. So one of the things discussed in the book, you're talking about 1788, 1793, all of these events that happened, and it talked about slave insurrections and how they jacked up the price of sugar. And so once you had these revolutions and they got rid of whatever aspect of colonialism, the colonizers saw fit to how can we exploit the liberation process? So they're able to set prices on their own terms because they don't have to deal with colonizers anymore. So we'll kind of be the friendly love bombers and say, hey, we'll make this deal for you, and then usurp that whole system once again, and once again colonize the system, and do even better is have imperialist forces. Once the technology was able to be had, we'll have imperialist forces come in and take over this country once again, and then recolonize, where you again speak our language, where you again use our form of economies, and you will not have access to it, or you have minimal access to it. And if you need access to it, you have to go through us. So it's further recolonizing, imperialist forces coming in once again and outright stealing land, stealing the resources, and then having the colonized people rent out their labor, or even worse. So this is continuing and continuing to this day. So colonizers saw, how can we exploit these liberation processes, these liberation movements to our advantage, not even celebrating or honoring that people would have an independence movement. No, 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 no. The only way that we know it under capitalism is to exploit. So there are varying situations in the book that discuss that.
And what were some examples that you noticed?
Where they exploited the Cuban liberation process. And I think that was a huge one for me, considering the situation of Cuba today and the blockade that exists. So for the book to discuss Cuba, I think that was the one that was like, the one for me that really, they continually had to fight. They fought against the Spanish, they fought against Batista, and look at what's happening today. So many countries that have fought for liberation. And again, Cuba was the one thing in the book. I was like, man.
It's still going on today.
Still going on today and fighting for liberation and having to continually do that because the colonizers just like, no, there can only be one. There can only be one force of power in this world. There can only be one system, and it's capitalism. So there can only be one.
And then a good point from that is that is the idea that there can only be, your idea that there can only be one in terms of capitalism versus any other type of system. This even existed in the arguments between monopoly and free trade. So Williams points out that the parties who are interested in monopoly versus free trade changed over time depending on what their economic interests were under capitalism. So when you would look at let's say like the late 1500s, early 1600s, where slavers depended on like various manufacturers for their products, whether it was like chains or ships or different items that made it possible to enslave and maintain such a system. They were all for free trade because it meant that the creators of different products, whether it was the Dutch with their ships, the Germans, the English with their products, they would all be competing with each other. To minimize cost to the slavers or the people who are controlling the actual people and the labor. The capitalists at the time, they didn't want to compete. And so they were all for monopoly, making sure that one industry is owned by only one company or one like set of people. And so like it was a very clear, the slavers were all for free trade, the capitalists were all for monopoly. But even within that system, it was all the idea of capitalism, where individuals and parties would own the means of production. Later on, close to the beginning of abolition, quote unquote, let's say like the 1800s, those ideas or those like arguments switched. So the capitalists were all for free trade. London bankers realized that slavery wasn't profitable anymore to them. So they wanted multiple ways of making money as opposed to relying on just slavery. The slavers still wanted the monopoly on different products that they produced and wanted to make sure that they were the ones who were making the money. And so you can see that switch in the like quote unquote abstract ideas of monopoly versus free trade. Both parties still had the same intention of accumulating as much wealth and power as possible. The monopoly versus free trade argument was really just a means of questioning who should have that power under the system of capitalism. It wasn't really a question of actually like dismantling capitalism or saying that, like all people should have the right to the resources that they need to survive.
Absolutely. And that misinterpretation of free trade goes on to this day where people think, well, free trade, it's a positive thing, right? So if we are to study neoliberalism and how they have promoted free trade, understanding that monopoly is the ultimate result of that, and only wealth can happen in the hands of a few, the ownership of the means of production can only happen in the hands of a few. So this misinterpretation, or on some ends, willful ignorance that capitalism somehow democratizes industry, which you still hear, it somehow democratizes industry because free trade democratizes industry. And you could come up in this democratization of free trade. That is such a neoliberal argument that has seeped into the consciousness of people who haven't studied capitalism and who haven't studied other economic and social systems. And one of the things that is discussed in this book, to your point, it talks about, for the West Indian colonies needed food. If they were to concentrate on the sugar to which the economic specialization of the mercantile epoch confined them, they had no backcountry where staples could not be raised, and their cash crop was too profitable for them to afford the luxury of diverting land and labor to cattle grazing and food crops. Quote, men are so intent upon planting sugar, a correspondent wrote to Governor Winthrop in 1647 about the West Indies, that they had rather buy food at very dear rates than produce it by labor. So infinite is the profit of sugar works after once accomplished. The tradition was thereby established by which sugar became the wheat of bread of the West Indies. Only the possession of the mainland colonies permitted this sugar monopoly of the West Indian soil. To subsist a colony in America, wrote the Abbé Raynal, it is necessary to cultivate a province in Europe. Britain voluntarily abdicated this privilege as a lesser of two evils to the mainland colonists. Mercantilism was ultimately destroyed as a bad system, but it is absurd not to recognize that it was a system and that there was method in its badness. Also, this was deliberate policy on the part of statesmen in England and the planters in the colonies. Many of the articles exported by New England to the islands could have been produced in the islands themselves. But as a Jamaican planter asked, if this island were able to maintain itself with diet and other necessaries, what would become of the New England trade? So there it is, the colonizers or the enslavers or the imperialists. They're like, well, where can we get our resources? Just by outright stealing them. Because there's no such thing as free trade as a positive thing. It's not this democratized system like people think. It's like, well, we don't have food. We don't have resources. We don't have wheat. We don't have this. We don't have that. We don't have coltan. We don't have the diamonds. We don't have the oil. So what can we do? Invade a country and just steal it and then have our military guard it so that no one else can get to it. So this pattern continues and goes on and on to this day. This book discusses it. It's a very important book to read if one is going to understand the nature of how this system has sustained itself in various forms. Again, capitalism's intent is the same, but its methods change over time, given technology, given all these other factors, given there are increasing liberation movements happening. So capitalism has to move around on the chessboard in order to do that. So a lot of places around the world have been economically dealing with Russia, for instance, former USSR. So how can we strangle the USSR? And in turn, strangle every other country that was dealing with it. So these things continue to this day. And it's important to understand that free trade is not democracy. Capitalism is not democracy. Monopoly capital is the goal. Monopoly capital is what they want to maintain, is what they want to uphold. And a tool of that is exploitation of labor, exploitation of land. It is inhumane to do what they're doing. How can you say that what you're doing is beneficial and you're depleting the earth? that temperatures are going up. And I know people say, well, it's a natural cycle or whatever, but to deny that humans participate in that, clear cutting forests so you can have cattle industry, and then on some occasion you feed those cattle themselves, which is where you got the mad cow from. So not even understanding how nature works, because that's not the role. The role is just to make profit. It's just like, it'll work out for itself, whatever. Like, we'll just create this land where we have fresh air. We'll ruin the actual air, but then we'll create a building where we can breathe in fresh air. Like, this is capitalism. I don't know what to say.
Like the idea of free trade, the arguments that they were making at the time, was not for the abstract idea of free trade in and of itself. It was to have the free trade to trade slaves and to destroy the land. And so you can even see this pattern in terms of like people who the groups who would historically argue for free trade. It would be people who weren't necessarily at the upper echelon of power, but still had like wealth and wanted to control how things were done. So like you could see this with for example, the slavers and the capitalists versus the mercantilists. So initially, the mercantilists were the ones who controlled the means of production, controlled the main process of how resources would go in and out of the country. Capitalists they're basically of the same family and had similar amounts of wealth. And in order to try to gain power, they pushed for free trade, which will allow them to freely trade slaves, freely destroy the land, freely do whatever they wanted to do in order to make a profit. Once they did get to that point where they could make a profit, and capitalists were the ones in power in parliament and Congress and controlled most of the things that were being created, it was only after that point that they started pushing for monopolies because they knew that the monopolies would be their own monopoly.
To your point, and getting to the point about amoral and immoral, there was even a portion in the book that discussed free trade being of this moral compass, and they even attached Jesus to it. Mm-hmm. So this idea that it is a moral thing to exploit people, this is why people are conditioned that capitalism is natural and it's something that has always happened around the world. There's always been processes. So you had feudalism, you had slavery, you have capitalism. There will be something else. And the people who hold on to capitalism and invest in it understand there's going to be something else because there is a change around the world right now. People understand that capitalism is inhumane, it is harmful. And so they are holding onto this thing. And this idea that it is attached to a moral compass and we need to attach the church to it, or it's I laughed so much when I saw that.
Yeah. Even with something that I mentioned, which we pointed out a bit earlier, is that even the church, even the Jesuits, the Dominicans of the Order of Dominic, and the Franciscans of the church were all involved in slavery. We're all involved in the slave trade. They all prayed for ships to be sent successfully. Even if you go to the different like slave ports in Africa right now, even when you go to like a couple of them in Ghana, there are some slave ports and slave castles where they stored slaves, and like built on top of those slave structures were churches. And there would be an opening from the top of the church where you could look down and see the slaves in their dungeons. It was connected to each other. It wasn't just Christianity, it was really every aspect of society. Whether it was like insurance, something that he mentioned was that there are court cases of like compensating and paying for slaves that died, whether they were pushed off of the ships themselves or made the choice to leave the ship and chose to be in the sea instead. There would be arguments for having them be compensated, but not having the slaves be compensated or having the African peoples be compensated, but having the slave traders or the people who invested in those slave traders be compensated for the loss of life. And so like we could see it in that way, insurance became a big aspect of British society spread across the world. You could see it in, he said, hard industries. So even the people who created the steam engine, the way that they were funded for doing so was by bankers who were involved in the slave trade. You could see the the kings and queens of England, the Queen of Spain, the kingdoms of the Portuguese. They're all involved in the slave trade as well. very much supported it and encouraged it. So on to like the point that we already stated earlier. It wasn't a thing of individual moralities, but it was more so a thing of the economic system at the time. And that's not something you can really address from an individual standpoint. It's something that the masses of the people have to really address and resolve as a collective.
The colonizers definitely dealt with things as a collective, even if they were warring against another based on moral compass or whatever, or, well, the enslavement doesn't benefit us. And, there was infighting about whether or not slavery was beneficial or if it was profitable, but they definitely worked together to keep the industry in their hands on their terms, to deceive people and condition people that their enslavement is something that is beneficial, which to this day, capitalism's intent is always the same. The methods may change. So what do they do in this day and age? Work ethic. Yeah, if you don't have a work ethic, you're lazy.
Mhm.
If you don't work hard, put yourself by the bootstraps, all of this stuff. This is the things we're conditioned with over and over and over again. So we're conditioned that being a wage slave is a positive thing. But what does it do? It benefits the profits of, if you want to call them enslavers, if you want to call them whatever you want to call them, CEOs, whatever. But it benefits their pockets. People who are wage slaves are not being paid their worth. You're renting out your labor, and there's a ceiling. So this idea that, people have liberation and, okay, we can make trade deals with you, and somehow you have that rooted from under you, is the story is the same. And there is so many narratives in this book that discuss that, and the idea that even discussing the price of resources like sugar, the price can go up or down depending on whether people are having a liberation process, just shows you that it's not equal. Because if you were dealing with people in an equitable way, you wouldn't have these price gouges, you wouldn't have these ups and downs, because we are equal at the table, so they say, and then we can negotiate prices. But if the colonizer depended on one time that a price was low at one point, and then people decided to have a revolution and the prices, that just shows things were not equal from the start, because the people who were either enslaved or in a position of not being liberated, like, they didn't make the decisions in where the pricing went for these resources. And so now the colonists, the capitalists, the imperialists are looking at, okay, oh, they want to do things on their own terms. How can we exploit that? And we have to understand, people are like, the oil is too high right now, I don't know. Understand the root of that, understand why things get price gouged. But even you go to the music industry, it costs a penny to make a CD or whatever. Why do they sell it for $25? So I mean, just you're paying for the packaging. And I know the people who processed it, I know that there are things in that process, such as labor, whatever. So the people who master the CDs, the people who process it, packages. So there's that as well. I understand that. But still, even with that, the industry is the one who decides what the prices are. And it doesn't mean that the people in between are being paid their worth. So it's the same exact thing. So people who are mining the materials, people who are on the fields with the sugar cane, all of these resources, there is some inequity. In fact, there's lots of inequities in that process. And the industries decide at what price those things occur. So we need to understand free trade is not equitable. Capitalism is not equitable. It is not democratic in any way, shape, or form.
It actually reminds me of another section that Williams describes when he points out the difference between indentured servitude of Europeans and the slavery of Africans. So he mentions that really most of the system of slavery, most of the like structures, processes of kidnapping, most of the institutions and the capital flow already existed even before Africans came into the picture or were forced into the picture, really. So initially it was Indians, then it was indentured servants who were primarily Europeans. But the thing with having the indentured Europeans, where for all of them, it was typically a temporary contract. So it would typically last like maybe a decade or a couple of years. Uh, it also, another thing was that the Europeans, even though they had extremely limited rights, they did have rights that exist and were protected by the law. So, for example, they had the right to own property. And it was in a lot of the contracts that the indentured servants, after the end of their service or the end of their servitude, they would be given the option. They would have the possibility of owning land afterwards. So they had something to look forward to. For Africans who were enslaved, they would be forced to work really for the rest of their lives. There is never really an end to the slavery for the vast majority of African people who were enslaved. Even their offspring, their children, and descendants were to be born into slavery, unless at the explicit choice of the slave master. And so Africans who were enslaved didn't have the option of owning any land, didn't have therefore any political power. Their labor was completely isolated from the benefits that they received, unless it was death, really. And there is no end in sight for Africans in slavery, up unless they had a slave revolt or unless they actively organized and fought for their freedoms.
Yep. And people discuss sharecropping as if it was this thing. Well, you eventually had the right to the land. It's like, when would that ever happen?
Yeah.
When would that happen? So one of the things that is discussed in the book, to the point you made earlier, it talks about the triangular trade thereby gave a triple stimulus to British industry. The Negroes were purchased with British manufacturers, transported to the plantations. They produced sugar, cotton, indigo, molasses, and other tropical products, the processing of which created new industries in England. So of course, new industries were created off the backs of Africans. When does that not happen? While the maintenance of the Negroes and their owners on the plantations provided another market for British industry, New England agriculture, and the Newfoundland fisheries. By 1750, there was hardly a trading or manufacturing town in England, which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade. The profits obtained provided one of the main streams of that accumulation of capital in England, which financed the Industrial Revolution. So again, capitalism was thrived through the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure anyone who studies capitalism is aware of that. But how did that occur? Through the enslavement of Africans, or the labor exploitation of Africans more specifically. The West Indian Islands became the hub of the British Empire, of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England. It was the Negro slaves who made these sugar colonies the most precious colonies ever recorded in the whole annals of imperialism. To proselyte, they were the fundamental prop and support of the colonies, valuable people whose labor supplied Britain with all plantation produce. The British Empire was a magnificent infrastructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. So all of these things, again, going back to the modern age, all of these things they give you, like Worker Appreciation Day, all of this, your labor is still being exploited. So all of these bells and whistles they give people to make it seem like workers are valued, your labor is still being exploited. The CEO at Amazon. All these people are making 60 times more than the people on the ground, on the line. But they have worker of the month, all of these things appreciated. Let's give gifts. And so, but even with that, talks about how the Africans who were being enslaved were valuable people, and their labor supplied Britain with all plantation produce. It's telling you right here, this is not coming from me. This is coming from the enslavers saying, well, of course they're valuable to us because without them, we wouldn't have our industry. Without them, like, we don't know how to do it. They possibly don't. I'm sure some of them do. But, you know, we don't, it's like the managers coming in and telling you how to do it and they don't even know how to do it. I've worked jobs where the manager doesn't even know how to do the job the rest of us can do, but they can tell us how to do the job. It's like, excuse me? Like, okay, stand here on this line then. Oh, I don't, like, managers don't know how to do it. So the enslavers and the overseers and the managers, they don't know how to work the fields. They just tell you how to do it. So of course you're valuable, because without workers, then nothing would get done. All of the worker walkouts that happened over the past year or two, and they called it a labor shortage because they understand how important the exploitation of labor is for capitalism to continue and to thrive. So they're going to give you platitudes. Of course they are. So it's just very interesting how all of this stuff is laid out in books like Capitalism and Slavery, that people still believe that capitalism is beneficial to humanity. I mean, if we look dialectically at things, sure, positives and negatives. Okay, we can look at industrialization giving us this technology where we're doing Zoom on, great. But overall, is capitalism beneficial to humanity? I would say not.
At least for I would agree, like, at least at the basic level of, like, does everybody have access to food, to housing, to the resources that they need to survive, and to community without having to work like 12 hours a day, every day, or without having to sacrifice most of their lives towards providing labor to people or organizations that don't actually benefit them. That hasn't really, at least I don't see it where I'm at. Maybe there is a place, but I'm not invited to that club.
There's a place in this world, we don't know where it is, but it's not under capitalism. Okay, no.
Yeah. Send me an invite. Send all of us.
I know. I know. We want to join the party.
You gotta send 7 billion invites.
Yes. Please, kind sir, send us an invite to your party. Please. We would love one.
Yeah. But yeah, like, even with the stopping of slavery, at least from the British, it wasn't really a moral thing. Williams notes that it was an economic thing. So by the 1760s, 1780s, slavery stopped being profitable for Liverpool. So for one, the sugar plantations, the main source of money for Britain in terms of the slave trade, was, for the most part, really just a lottery and a gamble. For one, it took a lot of depths of, like, the slavers and the planters and the slave traders. It required long credits, whether it be like a year or like multiple years to get to the point of, like, maybe having a profit. And then the high potential of bankruptcy, say like a storm comes and destroys the ship, or like there's like a bad harvest season, so it is impossible to produce. All of those factors were always there, but eventually the Liverpool decided that, at least the merchants in Liverpool, they decided that the risk of and the profit motive for it wasn't what they wanted anymore. And so at that point, they pushed towards the end of slavery on a systematic level. But beforehand, it wasn't really seen of as like a bad thing.
Yeah, it talks in the book about, to say it plainly, I think the 5-second or less explanation or 20-second or less explanation in the book, it says the Negro slaves were the strength and sinews of the Western world. So without the exploitation of Africans, you wouldn't have the industries you have. You wouldn't see the global takeover of the global South without this industry of enslavement, which that was the first massive industry that built capitalism. And so without that, you may not have seen the situation we're seeing today in terms of having the US be a massive imperialist force around the world. And that's another reason I really do think it is crucial to read books like this, and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I think reading this information would make a lot of sense to folks to answer the question of, well, if Africa is so wealthy, why are Africans so poor? This book will give you an answer. It will give you some nuance. It will give you some reasoning, and it will give you some history as to why Africans around the world, the material conditions are not the best for us. So I think it's crucial, instead of saying, Africans don't like us over here, and, we had it worse than people in Jamaica or whatever. Enslavement to Africans happened all over the world. The imperialist forces affected Africa. Further recolonization, neocolonialism, all these things affect the African world wherever we are. So to say that someone's conditions are worse than another's, we have to look to Africa itself to understand the conditions. So to say that you have it worse because you're in the US, then we could talk about indigenous folks totally being massacred. If you want to start there, and you mentioned it, there was a massacre of indigenous folks in order to take the land, and then you have enslavement of people. So there is a cycle, and it didn't just affect one group of people. So we have to understand the roots of a lot of this. We have to understand the roots of all of this to once again know that capitalism is not democratic. The objective of capitalism is not to help the masses of the people in any positive way. The objective is the same, but the methods change over time, given technology, given all sorts of things happening around the world. So you have to shift. If there's mass revolutions happening, you're like, oh, wait, people don't like what we're doing. Okay, how can we convince them that, we're for them? Oh, we'll sneak in and, we'll do that. And then we'll put our people in. So that's what's happening around the world. And even going back to Cuba, this is exactly what they did. So the imperialist West, US in particular, has established a blockade. Okay, so there's not a lot of medical resources. They might not have the things that people take for granted here. It's like, the food that we want to eat, all of these things, we may not have those things. And they'll use the Oasis campaign to say, well, it's because of the dictatorship over there. And if you don't talk about the history of the blockade, you'll believe that it's because, it's a dictatorship. So you have to do away with this misinformation. You have to educate yourself on all sides to come to a conclusion. If you are not aware of the history, 1960, there's a little history where it's like, oh, they had a revolution. They got rid of Batista. So we'll wage a campaign to make sure that people starve. This is documented in the US government. So it's not like, there's a dictatorship. Yeah. So there was a concerted effort that was successful in many ways around the world to starve out the people. So then they go, well, our government's not doing anything for us. We need other people to come in and intervene, which is exactly what happens all the time. And so the imperialist forces in the West are like, we're getting what we want. And there is a basis for that. And you can read that in books like Capitalism and Slavery. You can read that in books like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And you can study the conditions of Africa, the history of that in class struggle in Africa, Kwame Nkrumah. So it's all there for us to study. So it's not necessary to be misinformed in the way many of us are. That makes no sense right now. With the internet out there, with a whole library out there, it makes no sense to be saying some of the stuff people are saying.
Even if you can find an audiobook of like some of these books, that would be vital. But like getting it through you, like getting that knowledge is vital. Whether it's like reading the book, finding an audiobook, communicating with people who have read the books before, like maybe starting a book club, joining an organization where we discuss those things is very key. Because even Malcolm X, he said, I would just paraphrase it, that you can't understand what's happening to the American Negro if you don't understand what's happening in the Congo. Well, he's not saying that like, oh, like one situation is worse than the other and one situation is better than the other. He's saying that there are forces that and organizations and groups of people who are utilizing the exploitation of both Congolese people and people in Africa and Africans in America, American Negroes, and utilizing the exploitation to make the exploitation worse for both parties and for Africans across the world. And really anybody that they have the power to exploit, even other Europeans or other people, even their brothers and sisters in organizations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what's actually happening in Ukraine. You know, I know people are like, well, they're European, they're more civilized, all of this. But there has been a movement since the 50s to destabilize Ukraine. So to look at what's happening now, or look at what's happening in Africa, to look at what's happening around the world, it has to have a root. It's like if you are sick in some way and you go to the doctor, and what do they ask you? What's your environment? Are you a smoker? What's your diet like? There's a root to, in many cases, the illnesses we may have. So you can't just look at the symptoms, you have to look at the root. Once again, why are Africans poor if Africa is full of wealth? Look at the root of why the conditions of Africans exist the way they are. So Malcolm X is absolutely correct in his assertion about that.
Yeah. And do you have any other comments or things that we should point out before we bid adieu?
Capitalism's intent is always the same. The methods may change over time, given whatever situation exists. The tools of exploitation is what builds capitalism, and they will continue to do that because it is beneficial to them. It is up to us to study those methods. It is up to us to understand the roots of those methods, and it's up to us to organize against those methods, because the only way we're going to save humanity is understanding those roots and organizing against that system. There are several podcasts. If you enjoy what we're talking about, if you are learning anything, if you find any benefit, there are other pieces of media you could look at, listen to, watch, etc. And so we have the Forward Ever podcast, which is on Spotify. We have our Ancestors' Voices, which is every Sunday. We have Revolutionary African Women, that is once a month. And we also have the weekly, even though it's bi-weekly now, or every other week, we have the weekly Pan-African news. Those are several of the A-APRP related media we can look at, and we discuss a lot of the same things, just in our own way. And there are lots of people that are doing this, and we definitely honor all of these because we have to spread this word. We have to spread this information because there is a whole ton of disinformation that is much more powerful. So we have to come together as a mass and counter these problematic bits of information which turns into collective bits of information where people are conditioned to work against their own humanity. So let's work for our humanity. Let's work to create a better world. Let's work to create better situation for future generations. And let's join an organization. If you're not in one, join one. If you don't like any organizations you see, create your own. As long as it's for the people's liberation, we support it. Forward ever, backwards never.
Forward ever.